Hey, can you hear me?
Hello there. This video is going to be a bit of a rambling, incoherent mess by the way, but if you have any thoughts on this topic, then I'd love to hear them. When I started playing SOMA, I fully intended to make one of my rambling 30 to 45 minute reviews in which I try and take a decent look at more or less every aspect of the game that stands out to me. I started taking notes in that way as I progressed through its early stages and was enjoying jotting down my thoughts on how the game brings a genuine sense of confusion that helps to drive the player deeper into its mystery, and how this combines with the way that the monsters function, particularly in their opening chapters, as our inability to look at them only heightens the sense of something truly horrifying, highlighting the sound design and creating a unique tension where we know that we should be afraid of something, but we don't know what it is. I was going to talk about the existence of a safe mode in which the player character is invincible, and about how this exemplifies the differences between SOMA and other first-person horror games, turning those players who chose that option from a fragile being who can only hide and survive in the shadows to an entirely invulnerable machine who doesn't need to pay attention to the scares and the monsters, and is instead capable of focusing more intently upon the world and the story. And I thought about the glaring comparisons to BioShock and maybe more so Alien Isolation, an entirely different game but in the same kind of outfit, and which came out at around the same time. But as you can tell, that's not what's happening today, and this is due to the fact that, although I still have all those thoughts, many of which are demanding to be discussed in this video, one factor emerged that led me to change my approach to the game, and to the way that I'm speaking about it. Because, much like in some of the labyrinthine corridors of the submerged, deserted facilities in which the vast majority of the title takes place, almost every route of my analysis of SOMA led me back to the same looming, unassailable monster blocking my path. I don't want this video to be 4 hours long, so instead I'm trimming it down to the essence of its most meaningful element. And it's become impossible to have any kind of meaningful discussion of SOMA without taking a look at the philosophical implications of its story. Please don't leave. I'm not fully equipped to do justice to said implications and the hold that they have over our lives, and it would take months and months of reading for me to reach that point, if it's even attainable in the first place. However, I do want to highlight the way in which the game's questions are delivered to the players, because for me they are absolutely brilliant. So, first things sort of first, what actually are these questions? And what the heck is SOMA? SOMA, spoilers, is a game that starts with its protagonist Simon knowing that he has just months, maybe even weeks, left to live. He was recently in a car accident that gave him terminal brain damage, and he is scheduled to have his brain scanned in an innovative attempt at treatment. You wake up, check your emails, play a little basketball, and then head into the city for your scan. Things are a little weird in the building where you're about to undergo your treatment, which is almost definitely not legal based upon, well, every single vibe that this place gives off. And you half expect to wake up 12 hours closer to death and with a big hole where your kidney used to be. However, what actually happens seems to be Simon's transportation to a decrepit underwater facility, which you soon discover exists in the year 2104, and contains, or perhaps more accurately, contained, the last known vestiges of humanity after an asteroid struck the Earth and killed off everyone topside. As Simon comes to understand, the facility was used in the construction of the Ark, a virtual world for copies of people's minds to exist, facilitated through developments in brain scan technology. And those vestiges that I mentioned, well, they're more fragments of humanity, each with a claim of being the real thing, but with their human elements divided amongst them, and never explicitly what we think of as human. There's the classic science fiction question of robots and whether or not they could be classed as human, especially given the diverse array of personalities that they demonstrate throughout the game's early stages. But there are also robotic platforms for human minds, where those brain scans that I previously mentioned have been uploaded into synthetic bodies, retaining the personality and the memories of the person who was scanned, but only up to the point of said scan. The humans that they are created from each lived on and each died, but this copy of their personality has been placed into a new synthetic body. Obviously, this brings about questions of whether or not they can be considered the same person. They are more or less the exact same, acting and reacting in the same way as the original would. And now that that human being is gone, the copy is the sole representative of that person and their ideas and beliefs. And yet, they are just a copy. Something like a clone, I suppose, but only of the mind rather than the body. But the corporeal forms are not forgotten either, as a portion of them inhabit the game's setting with their own claim to some kind of humanity. SOMA's primary antagonist is an artificial intelligence called the WOW, short for What a... And in typical science fiction fashion, the WOW is a murderous artificial intelligence following the seemingly benevolent orders given to it by its human overlords. But instead of solving the problems of climate change or preventing synthetic life from eradicating organics, the WOW's directive demands that it preserve humanity. It has failed in doing so in the purest form of humankind, so instead it has created 3 different types of survivor from the bodies of the dead, living more as a twisted legacy of what is human, and arguably the closest continuation of humanity that it is still possible to achieve. The first of these are the living corpses, half-dead humans who are technically still alive but are only able to stay this way thanks to the WOW preserving them against their will, taking away their ability to move or act and rooting them into the station, rendering them more as a type of plant or fungus than as an animal capable of its own movement and agency. These unfortunate souls are generally amidst the gore that sprouts from them and bubbles across the surface of their surroundings, suggesting, especially in tandem with their frequent connection to the healing points and the existence of those same points in gory scenes in locations with no apparent corpses, that they might even be suffering a fate of dissolution, slowly transforming into nothing but a living sludge that, made up of living human flesh, the WOW considers a successfully preserved human. The AI also reanimates corpses and turns them into monsters, mindless killing machines that roam the halls, walking and making noises with some kind of basic volition. Far beyond simply having their agency and humanity stripped away, the minds of these monsters are entirely inhuman, serving motives that are actively opposed to those that the human characters would have supported, and acting without the more conscious functions of personality or wit. But they can still react to their environment and chase the player character throughout the underwater facility. And speaking of Simon, the game's protagonist is the final example that I want to mention of some sort of reanimated monster. Because, created by the WOW, Simon is arguably the most human of the bunch. See, Simon as we know him in 2104 has not been transported to the future, but is instead a combination of the brain scan taken from the human Simon in 2104 and a biosynthetic body, made up of the corpse of one of the facility's workers and a robot body that helps to bridge the gap between the two. Are we Imogen Reed, the corpse who has been reanimated, or are we Simon Jarrett, a copy of whose mind is responsible for our consciousness and perception of the world around us? And are we more human than the others, having both the mind and the body, sort of real people? Well, whereas it's feasible to see Simon as having both of those elements, and the other characters occupying the setting as only ever really having one of each, I don't think it's that simple, because he also has neither. His body is only half human, and his computerized mind is explained as being simplified by comparison to those created from scans conducted in the 22nd century, meaning that we are also only half accurate to the human mind of Simon. If we were looking for some kind of mathematical answer, we could turn to René Descartes' famous assertion that cogito ergo sum, I think, therefore I am. Not only can that statement be used to argue that those capable of thought, the robot bodies with human minds and the corpses imprisoned in the walls of the setting, must at least exist and be alive, and that because their thoughts are those of humans, they are, in no uncertain terms, human. But it is also largely responsible for creating a sense of duality between the mind and the body that endures in how we think of each to this very day. And if this seems a little outlandish and irrelevant, well, you might be right. But the title SOMA comes from a Greek word meaning the body as distinct from the mind and soul. So I think it's fair to suggest that this sort of thing was at least considered over at Frictional. We, and specifically we as Simon, can trust nothing but the existence of our consciousness. So therefore our consciousness and our body are in separate categories and cannot be one and the same. They are two halves of our being, and the robots and the monsters have more or less the full capacity of one of these elements. The robots the mind, the monsters the body. And Simon, as I've detailed, has about half the capacity of each, making him 2/4, or 1/2, human. And the corpses of human bodies and thoughts, but an inability to use those bodies and no power to think of anything but their suffering, are sort of the same. Sorry, that was a very meandering point to reach a very simple, formulaic way of looking at things, but what I mean is that Although I think we naturally see the protagonist as more human because he is inherently related to us and our goals and perspective, this being a first-person game, there is no simple, clear-cut answer presented throughout the majority of the game as to what and who is human, dead or alive or synthetic or otherwise. And as an aside, I really wish I'd made this video before I did the Mass Effect one, because boy oh boy does this game show us a different side of the old synthesis ending. Okay, so we also have to ask a question that I think has become so much of a joke that many have long forgotten why it was ever asked in the first place. Why is philosophy important? Why is it significant to question what is human when you and I both know that we are humans, watching or recording this video and both thinking, Jesus Christ, this guy is annoying, when is he going to shut up? Don't worry, we're getting there. Well, SOMA argues that without an understanding, a consensus of what humanity is, there's the potential for a descent into violence, and quite possibly into an eradication of humanity altogether. Now, said eradication of humanity might come as a loss of what it means to be human, with the true definition being entirely lost and humanity thus striving for answers in a world that is built around a false idea of what we should be. Meaning that we can never be happy or fulfilled because we are constantly struggling in the name of a goal that doesn't actually help us in any way whatsoever. And I'd say that that's a pretty good description of where we are as a species right now. I'll let you fill in the blanks on that one. But there's also the possibility that the eradication is much more tangible than that, which is seen in the violence that the WoW conducts against us and that we perpetuate on others. See, the AI's primary objective is in fact the same as ours. It seeks to preserve humanity through its methods, and we seek to do the same through launching the Ark and allowing the minds to live on as a normal human selves for thousands of years, maybe even longer. So why don't we and the WoW get along? Well, that's because there is a violent point of divergence between the WoW and Simon, which is that the two parties believe in very different concepts of humanity. Which makes a lot of sense given that one is a human from 2015 and the other is an artificial intelligence from post-apocalyptic 2104. We, Simon, seek to preserve the mind, and the WoW seeks to preserve the flesh. Holding a different opinion of what is human is how you arrive at the fiercely, fundamentally opposed positions of the protagonist and antagonist. And this bears out into real-world examples as well. Because time and time again, be it in war or be it in so-called peace, human factions have killed others on an unthinkable scale. And in those instances, those wars and those genocides, we see something akin to this, a strategic practice of dehumanization. One of the most grotesque things that a human can do is to kill another human, and the mental toll of this upon those who do it professionally is often enormous. In order to combat this and to take out the hesitations of those participating, countless campaigns have sought to dehumanize the other, using propaganda, racial slurs, and countless other methods to turn the people on the other side into subhumans not worthy of empathy. Many Americans who fought in the Vietnam conflict have described how specific terms that I'm not going to use here were applied to East Asians as a whole, sowing uncertainty into their humanity by painting them in a subhuman light that facilitated their killing, even though the alleged intention of the war was to protect the South Vietnamese population. To go to a more extreme example, the big one, in fact, you're probably aware of those intense dehumanization campaigns carried out through propaganda in 1930s Germany, which led to, well, we all know where that sentence is going. And I think it's significant that this is also used to remove humanity from those doing the killing. That hesitation that I mentioned earlier, that second where someone might have second thoughts about ending another human being's life, that demonstrates the type of humanity that is specifically targeted in these tactics. The people holding the guns are turned into nothing but an extension of the gun. Thoughtless, blameless killing machines. I think I used that expression earlier. If I didn't, then the monsters in SOMA are a good example of what I'm talking about here, who are themselves inhuman. As such, we are left with a tool, such as a rat trap, and an animal, such as a rat, rather than two people. And it is natural and less morally ambiguous as a rat trap to kill a rat. And that's how it becomes a simple function of a faction rather than the unthinkably monstrous action of society's most dangerous individuals to kill another human being, and to yearn for the eradication of others like them. SOMA highlights how, when there is uncertainty in the status of someone's humanity, it is deemed acceptable to kill them, thus demonstrating the potential importance of providing some kind of answer to questions such as, what is human? Actually, I've tied humanity to morality there in a way that's maybe important to look at. Regardless of what we actually think about the human race, we use terms such as humane and humanity to describe the ethical path. And SOMA does offer different moral routes for its players in how they deal with certain issues that arise. Relatively early on, we are given choices over how we deal with two of the sort of surviving workers in the facility. The first is a robot with the consciousness of a man whose fully dead body we find just down the hall, and the second is a woman who exists in the half-alive corpse state, being sustained by the wow. In both instances, we have a path that is blocked, and there are two solutions. One is longer and more complex, but is not detrimental to the individual who we encounter, and the other includes the physically easier decision of leaving the robot in perpetual agony, or killing the woman in question. And what's interesting to me is that neither of these decisions has any real bearing on the events of the rest of the game. Unless I'm mistaken, it's not as though they have a major effect upon the ending in some kind of morality system, instead only encouraging us to focus upon our own morality and to determine whether or not we're comfortable with that. Seeing as one is a robot and the other might be considered euthanasia, these moments also help to highlight what we consider human or worth saving, especially as, to us as players, we know that these are not real people and they are entirely artificial. And these ideas themselves inform the philosophy and our approach to the remainder of the game's ideas. We are not judged, nor presented with a right or a wrong, but instead, in this game that so openly encourages us to consider the humanity of largely inhuman beings, we are invited to think for ourselves about what we're doing and to make a decision regarding whether or not that's an okay path to be taken. SOMA, unlike so many games, doesn't fall into the trap of answering its own ethical questions, instead leaving us to ponder them, rather than mindlessly choosing Paragon or whatever. And for me, this is much more effective, and much more likely to actually get me to think about said questions, than a system in which the moral path is already outlined for its players, and where I'm just a mindless passenger on the journey that is presented. Speaking of mindless passengers, I have no idea what's happening. I have a lot of notes left, but this video has changed so many times that I don't know which, if any of them, are valuable to me anymore. The ceiling is melting and the walls are closing in. This looks like it might be the end. I guess the reason that I'm making this video is that all of the little things in SOMA are really effective in working towards that same goal and making us question the same things that we might, in other games, take for granted. Like, the game spends so much time writing in new ways for us to relate to our fellow robots and to consider their position as alive, and then it will add in a delightful game of tag in which we're actually tasing an insane robot to death as it struggles to understand what is happening and why. There's the fact that we have to accept early on that we are not human, but some contraption based upon the thoughts of a man who died 90 years ago, and the following understanding that the Ark cannot save us or humanity as a whole. This means that we adjust to accept the inevitable loss as, unlike with the vast majority of games, our understanding is that the protagonist and the rest of humanity have perished by the time the story gets going. He literally died on the 1st of June 2015, less than a month after the game's intro and 89 years prior to the events of the rest of the game. We even get to listen to our treatment failing and the heartbreaking moments and realizations on the day of our death, which leads us to question what we are fighting for. And we realize that it's the preservation of those remnants of human life, the chance for something, anything, to live on, but with the crucial distinction, as I mentioned earlier, from the WoW's near identical goal, that we do not see the life that it has created for its victims as living. I think it's fascinating when we are asked early on if, instead of living in the Ark, which is really Simon's main motivation for much of the game, we would like to accept death, or still cling to the hope of some sustained life, even after the same survey has effectively just spent 6 or 7 questions convincing us that everything is shit, and the prolonged existence of the conscious minds aboard the Ark isn't actually reality. But it's very real, horrifyingly so. For one, someone whose brain scan we bring back to life in order to bypass one particular obstacle, before turning him off and back on again and again and again, plunging him in and out of his existence and wiping his memory each time. Why wouldn't it be real for him after all? His whole existence is there on that screen and then it disappears as we reset him again. And that sense of reality, at least for the character, is why it feels so disturbing as our companion visually and orally poses as his partner, with whom we discover that he had a relationship by snooping through his long-abandoned personal effects, in order to convince him that he is alive and well in the organic world, that he doesn't just exist inside a simulation, and manipulate him into giving us the information that we need. He doesn't feel like an amalgam of ones and zeros as this happens, and we again take to wondering what we've done. And a similarly disturbing exploitation of this museum of the yester-human is seen when we heal from the wow points that seemingly feed off, or at the very least, thrive near to, the corpses that are kept alive against their will. Whenever we progress at the detriment of others, or feed off the systems that spawn their torment, we are again confronted with the ceaseless questioning of humanity and of what it means to be human. Is it, as much android-oriented science fiction would have you believe, the capacity to show empathy? Because that doesn't feel like what we, the players, are doing. And that puts us as less than or equal to the other inhuman characters from the game. So what right do we, even as the players of the game rather than just the character, have to take away their lives and their happiness? There's a moment where we ourselves are plugged into this monstrosity, or at least where we begin to be, and at that point you have to wonder, would we be happy if someone else just came along and stole our life force from us? No? Well, then it turns out you're just a big old hypocrite. But you'll get an active chance to make decisions that involve the fate of Simon, because at one point in the game your consciousness is copied into a new body, and you have to decide whether or not to euthanize the original. Well, not the original Simon, but the original of the Simons from 2104. I wonder how many people do that by comparison to the other terrible things in the game, and the reasoning behind their decisions either way. It's a lot more complex a choice to euthanize someone who would otherwise be trapped in one tiny dark room for an eternity than it is to torture someone for the rest of time, because it's easier than walking through a couple of extra rooms. And is it better to be alive in that world? In this world, or to... Sorry, I recently uploaded I'm feeling very tired. I'm just a little... Whatever your opinion on a decision in SOMA, there's a complexity to its overall style of questioning that inherently opens up doors that cannot be closed. And if you watched my video speaking about the endings of Mass Effect 3, you'll know that, done right, I believe that to be one of the most interesting things that a piece of art such as SOMA can do. And although the game is, at times, pretty heavy-handed in delivering those questions, it's nice to see them successfully posed through this narrative world and genre of storytelling rather than the same old androids exist and now they're second-class citizens angle that the majority of the fiction approaching these discussions seems to come from. What I'm saying is, this game felt much more like a breath of fresh air and much more successful in asking those questions than Detroit Become Human did. I've really run out of steam with this now, and as I said at the beginning, I don't know how to talk about this with the depth that it deserves. I'm just sort of hoping that this can at least manage to raise the questions for some of you. But as a sort of final, maybe summarizing point, I feel like it's worth noting that all of these questions and philosophical inquiries are enhanced when we think of the organic Simon from the start of the game, terminally ill and less than a month from the date of his death. He, of course, is interested in preserving his life beyond the bounds that would naturally be available to him, trying a radical treatment program with the hope that it will lead him to a life that is extended beyond his current date of death. Simon has a pressing concern, and were he able to play the game of his life, I think it's interesting to wonder what he would choose. Is he happy to go on? Does he wish to be powered down? After witnessing the implications of an extended life, of all the chaos and inhumanity that his reintroduction to the world creates, and of the betrayal that he feels he suffers, which his arc-bound self doesn't know about when he reunites with Catherine, I suppose, and the loneliness of his several existences in the future, would he prefer to be buried once and for all, especially given the fate of humanity as he comes to understand it? I almost wished that the whole thing was some vision or dream, not because I yearn for a happy ending, or because I think that that would be a particularly good ending, but because I think that the original Simon's reaction to this information, within his specific circumstances and without the fight for survival that the future Simon, this is starting to sound like another Misfits video, has to go through, would be thoroughly intriguing. And above all else, is it just me, or is it getting dark in here? Thanks for watching. I really appreciate you sticking around for this one, dense as it was, and as always, if you had any thoughts on this video, or on SOMA, or I guess, like, if you want your consciousness to be copied so that a version of you can live on for thousands of years even after the human race has collapsed, then do let me know in the comments below. So thanks again, and I really